It is Thanksgiving, but the question of who is the turkey is still an open one. The deadline given by Donald Trump to Volodymyr Zelensky was tomorrow, Thanksgiving. And if he didn't want to sign up to the Donald Trump peace deal, then he could, and I quote the president, fight his little heart out. Well, that was a clear enough indication that Trump was pulling stumps, was saying this far and no further. This war has got to end. But it isn't. And the deadline has been missed. And I'm going to argue the probably unpopular line that the turkey in this picture is not the one that was pardoned there by Donald Trump. It's definitely not the snow-coloured one in that picture, the one that's basted and glazed in the Oval Office just a few months ago, told he had no cards, told that he shouldn't have started a war that he couldn't finish. It's not anyone other than Donald Trump. What do I mean by that? First of all, it requires you to bear with me when I say that I genuinely believe that Donald Trump is trying to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. I genuinely believe that the peace plan, 28 points, that he drew up following the Anchorage summit between him and President Putin was a decent and genuine effort to bring the war to an end. I believe the man that butchered the turkey is Marco Rubio. I believe that Marco Rubio has allied himself with the part of the Republican Party that wants the war to continue, with the entire Democratic Party and its establishment and their media, and of course the yapping chihuahuas of the European Union. I believe that Rubio has formed a ramp with them to gut the 28 points of anything meaningful in them that could have led to a peace agreement. I said to you just the other night on Sunday that it goes without saying that anything amended to suit Ukraine will commensurately fail to suit Russia, and that the difference between the two parties was that the latter was losing the war and the former was winning it. Russia is winning the war. The loser in a war does not get to dictate the terms of its ending. And I believe that now this war will continue until an unconditional surrender is signed, not in Budapest, not in Istanbul, not in Saudi Arabia or the UAE, but I believe the final unconditional surrender will be signed in Kiev. Of course, it goes without saying that I hope against hope, that I'm wrong about that. But let's analyze how we've got to the stage where that is my honest point of view. Well, the 28 points became roughly 20 points. Some say 19 points. But in the fewer number lies the bigger devil in the detail. The whole point of Russia's special military operation, on which such blood and treasure has been expended, such international ostracism and exclusion has been suffered, that it's simply ludicrous to expect Russia to stop the war that it's winning on the basis of a program which allows Ukraine to join Ukraine. That's simply ridiculous and absurd. Equally ridiculous is the idea that 20 or so members of NATO, not wearing NATO badges, will send their armed forces into Ukraine. Not just into Kiev, but Mr. Macron, President Macron, he's a particular affection for his forces being stationed in Odessa. You need to know a bit of history here. 100 years ago, French forces were in Odessa. and they were driven out ignominiously by the Red Army and the resurgent forces of the Bolshevik Revolution. And they have never forgotten it, and their president is determined to return to it. They know they'll never get back to a Crimea war, but the British are desperate, salivating, even as they deliver a budget of penury, poverty, and cold for their own people at home. They are determined to situate their own sons and their own country's wealth in the western part of Ukraine, maybe even in the capital of Kiev. Both of these clauses are not just unacceptable, they are literally non-starters. They are the precise reason why Russia started the special military operation in the first place. But the 19 or 20 points that Marco Rubio, in a marvelous, wonderful meeting, he said that he had with the Ukrainian side, is sincerely putting these forward as an offer to President Putin and the Russian government. Well, the plan fails on those two cases alone, but there are more. The plan requires Russia to agree to $100 billion, euros actually, of their sovereign wealth to be stolen by the European Union, by NATO, and spent in Ukraine on their behalf. Now, they don't mean spent on the parts of the Ukraine that have been liberated by the Russian armies. They mean to spend Russia's 100 billion euros on Zelensky's Kiev, Ukraine. You really think the Russian taxpayer would agree to that? The plan for the demilitarization of the Ukraine was a fundamental part of the reason for the SMO in the first place. A demilitarized Ukraine means an army of 100 or 200,000. Trump's original plan reduced the Ukrainian army to 600,000. Rubio's rodent attempt to wreck Donald Trump's peace plan sets the Ukrainian armed forces at 800,000. That's almost 10 times the entire strength of the British armed forces. Now, of course, Ukraine could not possibly afford a standing army of 800,000 people, but then you'd be paying for it. You, the taxpayers of the United Kingdom, that were just hammered today to the highest ever level of taxation in Britain. 38% of your whole income will now go on tax. So you could maintain Zelensky's army in Ukraine, so your sons can be conscripted to go and stand and wait for hostility and death in the Ukraine, as Macron has just told the young men and women of France that they must do. He's introducing conscription in France and has advised Keir Starmer to do the same in Britain. An 800,000 strong standing army paid for by you. Plus the accelerated membership into the European Union, so that you, the European taxpayer, can carry the burden of the basket case, which is the Ukrainian society forevermore, rather like you are doing in the NATO protectorate in Kosovo, so called. These proposals are not just a disaster for any possibility of ending the war. They guarantee the continuation of the war. Trump's peace plan has become a new war plan because, of course, when Putin, as he inevitably would have to, rejects root and branch what we must now call the Rubio peace plan, then of course they will use that rejection to put your expenditure on weapons and war, your commitment of your sons and daughters to that war, and if Rubio feels he can get away with it, to force the United States to become not less involved in the war, but more involved in the war. That's how it looks to me. We'll hear from Scott Ritter and from Che Bose how it looks to them. But my take, and I was quite recently in Russia, my take from everybody I spoke to, that the underlying and indeed overwhelming principle involved in their agreeing or not to call off the SMO is that their sons and daughters will not have to fight this war again. But if you've got French forces in Odessa, if you've got British forces in Kiev, if you've got Latvian Boy Scouts in Kiev, if you've got German forces in the Ukraine, not wearing a NATO badge, wearing a European Intervention Force badge, then fighting this war all over again is inevitable. It's guaranteed. Because Rubio proposes a kind of Chapter 5 security agreement by these guaranteeing forces, mainly European Union forces and United Kingdom forces, whereby if anything happens, all of these countries have to, it's even stricter than Chapter 5 of the NATO treaty, which doesn't compel anyone, merely compels them to give consideration to any attack on a NATO member. This Rubio plan agrees a European Chapter 5 which will compel its members to begin hostilities in support of Ukraine if any breach of the treaty agreed is detected. Well, of course, any provocation, any agent provocateur, any false flag could bring the whole European Union armies into direct war with Russia. And Russia has been here before. This is something so many people, too many people, just have forgotten or perhaps never knew. I told you about the French forces driven out of Odessa in the early 1920s. What about the British forces in Murmansk and Archangel, sent by Winston Churchill to occupy swathes of Russia? We had 100,000 British soldiers who thought they were going home at the end of the First World War, but who were instead sent to occupy Russia. Russia will not tolerate that again. And why would they, when they are winning the war? But there's a second, even bigger and more recent reason. Russia was invaded through the Ukraine by Adolf Hitler. If you want to go back, invaded through Ukraine by the Kaiser. If you want to go back, invaded through Ukraine by Napoleon. There's a reason why Russia made Ukraine their red line. They know that an invasion through the Ukraine is a dagger at the heart of Moscow, of St. Petersburg, of Russia as a state. And it's not as if these European leaders have made any secret about their ultimate objective. They have repeated it over and over again. Russia is too big, they say. Russia is too powerful, they say. Russia is too rich, they say. Russia will have to be broken up. There needs to be 5 Russias, or 7 Russias, or 10 Russias. The better, through balkanization, to be dominated and controlled by the same world forces, economic and political, that dominate so much else of the globe. For these reasons and many more that I'm sure my friends will agree to talk about in the rest of the show, Marco Rubio has set Donald Trump up to fail. He has deliberately sabotaged the Trump peace plan and shattered it into a dozen pieces. He has dashed the hopes of tens, scores, hundreds of millions of people all around the world. A peace plan that is agreed by Zelensky is not worth the paper that it isn't written on. You know, Russia has still not seen even the 28-point plan, never mind the 19 or 20-point plan. Nothing has been sent to them. This is an attempt to railroad Russia into agreeing a plan that will bring not peace but the danger of ever-present war. This is an attempt to place the Ukraine, having lost all those men, having lost all that land, having lost all that blood and treasure, right at the tip of the spear, which Russia's historic enemies refuse to put down, refuse to beat into a plowshare. Just time for 2 minutes on the British budget. Keir Starmer's government, the most unpopular in the entire history of British politics. Keir Starmer, the most unpopular Prime Minister since polling began. The British Labour government was today, while that budget was being adumbrated, which was not necessary because it had all leaked before the budget, something that once upon a time would have caused the Chancellor to be forced to resign. The British police were handcuffing Britain's farmers who had come on an entirely lawful, entirely peaceful protest to be in Whitehall with their tractors, causing no trouble. They're not French, you know, and which had already been agreed by the Metropolitan Police. The men, the tractors, had all been paid. All of their congestion charge had been paid. All of the necessary papers had been obtained. The entire thing had been coordinated with the Metropolitan Police. But as she was speaking, farmers, the people who feed us, the people without whom we would starve, were being carried away in chains, arrested by the same police officers who are usually found arresting old age pensioners, old ladies, and disabled people on Saturdays and Sundays on another matter. It was, I believe, highly symbolic of the way in which Britain is going to the dogs. We'll see if the dogs of war prevail when we talk to our star guest, Scott Ritter, right after this short break. Stay tuned.